She stood in the courtroom very quietly, almost motionless, as if something inside her had already broken long ago. People around were whispering, some even smiling, because the news had already spread through the whole building. She had lost the case, and now she had no apartment, no money, and no support. Her husband walked out of the courtroom first, laughing loudly while fixing his expensive jacket. He did not even look back at her. He only threw a cold remark over his shoulder, saying that the old hen had finally been left without a roof over her head. A few people nearby chuckled, and she simply stood there listening to the echo of his confident footsteps disappearing down the long corridor. Her hands trembled slightly, but her face stayed calm, because over the years she had learned how to stay silent. She had learned how to endure. She had learned how to listen to humiliation without reacting. When they first got married, he had seemed like a different man, attentive and kind. At least that was how she remembered him. But time, money, and influence slowly turned him into someone colder, someone harder. He became a well-known businessman, a man respected by officials and feared by competitors, and little by little she became only a quiet shadow beside him, a woman he no longer noticed. When the arguments began, she tried to save the marriage. She believed things could still be repaired, but one evening he came home with another woman, young, confident, smiling in a way that said she already belonged there, and he calmly announced that life would now be different. That was the beginning of the long legal battle, months of hearings filled with tension and quiet cruelty. His lawyers were the best in the city. They spoke loudly, confidently, with cold logic. They presented her as weak and useless, a woman who had supposedly contributed nothing to their life or to his success. Day after day the court seemed to lean more toward his side. Every morning she arrived in the same simple coat, sat in the same seat, and listened as strangers dissected the years of her life like they were reading from a dull report. Sometimes she felt as if her strength was fading, as if there was nothing left to fight with, but somewhere deep inside a small spark of hope still remained, because she knew the truth. She knew how many nights she had worked beside him, how many times she helped him plan the first risky steps of his business, how many times she supported him when everything seemed ready to collapse. But no one wanted to hear that story, because his name carried weight, while her voice barely carried across the room. And today it was finally over. The judge announced the decision. The apartment would belong to him, the money would remain under his control, and she was expected to leave and begin a new life somewhere else. People slowly began leaving the courtroom. Some glanced at her with quiet sympathy, others walked past as if she were invisible, yet she still stood there for a moment as if waiting for something, though she did not know what it was. Then she slowly turned and walked toward the exit, step by step, calm and steady, like someone who had already accepted her fate. Outside the evening air was cold, the wind moved through her hair, cars passed by on the street, and she stood on the courthouse steps looking at the city that had once been her home. Then suddenly a black car stopped beside the curb. The door opened and an older man stepped out wearing a dark coat. He approached her slowly and looked carefully into her eyes. She recognized him at once. He was someone her husband had always spoken about with both respect and fear, one of the most powerful investors in the country. She did not understand why he was standing here. The man spoke quietly and said that he had watched the entire case and wanted to ask her a question. Why had she never defended herself? Why had she stayed silent when the accusations were thrown at her? She smiled gently and answered that sometimes truth does not need loud words. Sometimes it only needs time. The man studied her face for several seconds, then nodded slowly and said that people like her were rare, and those were exactly the kind of people he searched for. She did not fully understand what he meant at that moment, but only a few days later things began to change. First she received a phone call from a large company asking for a meeting. Then another invitation followed. Then another. It turned out that the same man had been observing her husband's business for many years and knew very well who had truly been behind many of the successful ideas and early strategies. He knew that she had helped create the first projects that brought enormous profit. Her name had simply never been mentioned because she had always remained in the background. Now he offered her the chance to start again, this time without someone else's shadow over her work. At first she was afraid. She doubted herself. but then she decided to try because she had nothing left to lose. The months that followed were slow and demanding. She worked long hours and rarely rested, yet for the first time in years she felt that people were actually listening to her. They respected her patience, her clarity, her calm way of solving problems. Gradually the company began growing faster than anyone expected. New projects appeared, investors became interested, and the quiet woman who once stood alone in a courtroom was now leading meetings filled with confident voices. Meanwhile her former husband continued living as if nothing had changed, convinced that he had already won everything that mattered. But one day the situation around him began to shift. The market turned sharply, several of his projects started losing money, partners slowly withdrew, and the most promising contracts somehow went to another company, the same company where she was now working. At first he ignored it, then he grew irritated, and finally one morning he saw a headline that made him freeze. On the screen was a photograph of a woman in a simple elegant suit, calm and confident, and beneath the photo was her name. The article explained that she had just become the new head of one of the fastest growing companies in the region, a company that was already surpassing several long-established corporations. He stared at the screen in disbelief, unable to move, while at that same moment she stood near the wide window of her new office looking out over the same city where she once walked out of court with nothing but silence and dignity. Everything felt different now, yet she did not feel anger and she did not feel the need for revenge. There was only a quiet sense of balance returning to the world, because life had placed every piece where it belonged. And in that moment she understood something very simple. Sometimes you can lose the loudest and most painful court case of your life, and still win everything that truly matters, if you keep your dignity, your patience, and your faith in yourself.